Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
This morning is what we call our Vision Cast message, and it's a little bit different than most of our mornings in that when we gather together on Sunday mornings, there's always a combination of teaching and leading. We're teaching the Bible, we're studying Scripture together, and there's leadership of who we are together coming out of that. So there's always those two things, teaching and leadership. For the next few weeks, our leadership team is going to be sharing about what God spoke to us during our annual vision retreat this fall. And so this one really, the weight is more on leadership and less on scriptural study. We'll, of course, have scripture as part of that, but our leadership team wants to share with you, and what we want to share with you is not only where we landed, but the process for how we got there. And the process is it's not a small thing, because what I want to share with you is I want you to know that as a leadership team, we're committed to not just reading the most recent book about Christian leadership or how to grow a business or something like that. We're not committed to human strategy. We're committed to making space to listen to God and asking Him to speak to us. And so as part of that, we want to share the process that as we say this is where we sense we're supposed to go this year, how we're supposed to get there. We want you to have the confidence that we're trying to hear from God. We're trying to discern His leading in this so that you can be a part of that as well. Because as God leads us, as we're here to serve the church in that capacity, we believe He's going to affirm those things in your heart and awaken them in yours as well. And so that's where we're going to go this morning. So the message I've titled, The Year of the Campfire, 2019, the Year of the Campfire. And campfire is a new image for us. Maybe if you were here at Christmas time, you heard us talk about the year of the campfire a little bit. In fact, we organized our Christmas service around different expressions of a campfire. So we moved for a few different places if you weren't here, but we started out in Heritage Hall with a kind of a campfire experience of singing in the round. And then we came in here and we had a campfire experience at the tables. And then we went outside and we had literal burning barrels and campfires, because we're creating the campfire experience. We're organizing our life around that. I want to explain that though, because over the years, God has given us a number of different metaphors, different pictures for understanding our life together. And so some of those are biblical. Some of those are ones we find right here in Scripture. There's like the image of the body. The church, I like to use the language that this expression of the church, we're one corner of His pasture, but we're a body. Right? And so as a body, that means that we're not all the same. Some of us are hands, and some of us are eyes or ears or mouth, or whatever that part is, but by ourselves, we're not a whole body. A hand by itself is not a body, it's just a hand. It's when it's connected to the rest of the body that it has purpose and adds meaning. And it's when we come together and we're knit together by the Spirit of the living God, and we're walking in unity, that we become a healthy, functioning body. Okay, that's a picture that helps us to understand our life together, and it gives us a shared language and a shared understanding of who we're supposed to be. Another one of those that we have that maybe it's not one you find in Scripture, but it's not unbiblical in any sense, is what I just mentioned a minute ago, that we're like a locker room. That today there's going to be football teams playing. In fact, some of them are playing right now, according to the guys in the sound booth. And what happens is they're out on the playing field, and when they go into the locker room, they pause from playing in the game for a moment. They go in the locker room, they get bandaged up, they revisit the playbook, they get coached up, they consider their strategy, and then they get sent back out onto the playing field. And for years now, we've said, when we come together on Sunday mornings, this is not the playing field. The church is not about what happens in this room. This is the locker room where we get bandaged up, we get some spiritual Gatorade, we get coached up, we revisit the playbook, but then we get sent out onto the field. And if what happens in here does not impact how we live out there, then there's no purpose, right? Church is all about what happens out there. It's about how we live, who we are out there. That's one of those images that has worked its way through our our culture together and our life together and given us a shared language for who we are. So this year we're adding a new one. It's not to contradict those, it's to add a new facet of our life together, and it's this idea of a campfire. And so the process for how we got there is that this fall, every fall in like mid-September, we send a team of people. Usually it's about a dozen people. It's our pastors, both our staff pastors and a couple of our volunteer lay pastors. And we go away. This time we were in Cascade for 3 days and 2 nights. And we just make space and ask God to speak to us. And what we're looking for is, we're not asking God, give us a new picture for this year. What we're looking for is missional clarity. And I want to take a minute to describe the difference between vision and mission, because we use those words, well, sometimes we use them interchangeably as if they're synonymous, and they definitely go together, but there's actually a little bit of a distinction in terms of how we use them. So here's our vision. This is the church's vision statement. We make the invisible God visible. Okay? If you weren't here when we first released that statement on a Sunday like this, on a Vision Cast Sunday, this was 2014. It was it was actually 2015. It was the result of our 2014 retreat. But what had happened is that year we'd been in the book of John, and in the book of John, there's a statement that happens very early. I think it's John 1:8, and John's describing Jesus' ministry. This is what he says about Jesus. He says, "No one has ever seen God." God's invisible. No one has ever seen him. But the Son, who is himself God, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. And so as we studied through John, we used that language that Jesus, throughout his ministry, he was making the invisible God visible. And he does that with his teachings. When you hear him, you're hearing the Father. He did this with his miracles. When you see him, you're seeing the Father. As he interacted with people, however he interacted with people, that was instructive, because when you see him, you've seen the Father, and Jesus says that throughout the book of John. And so when we went away in 2014, we had just reached the 25-year mark as a church, and we were asking God to give us fresh vision for the next generation. And we're like 25-year vision, we were at the place where we were realizing we're in a transition between the first generation of Vineyard Boise, and we're moving into the second generation of Vineyard Boise, and say, God, would you give us clarity? What's the vision that you want us to run with? And throughout that retreat, this is what emerged, and we ran with. And so we came back that year and said, okay, here's our 25-year vision that we've got to mature into and flesh out. We are to make the invisible God visible. We're just carrying on what Jesus started, and we're now invited into his ministry. That's the family business that we're in. And so you'll hear me say that. You'll hear me sometimes as we're leaving on Sunday, we're going back out onto the playing field. I'll say, okay, go make the invisible God visible, because that's our vision. So when we go away every year, we're not looking for another one of those. Okay, God gave us that to us for a generation. Maybe it's not a full 25 years, we don't know. But that's like a long-term vision. But what we need every year is we need fresh mission. If you think about from like a military perspective, if there's a war happening, there's the big picture of what the war is about, and then there's specific missions within that. So right now, we need to take this shore, or we need to take this mountain, or we need to take this airstrip, right? Those are specific missions that are specific campaigns within the big picture of the war. So our big picture is we're making the invisible God visible, but every year there's this, how are we doing that now? What's the current campaign? So it's almost as if you put this mission statement back up, there's like an implied by at the end of that. We make the invisible God visible by, there's an implied there. So for years it's been this, it's been by being in Garden City for Garden City. So under this banner, and we actually literally created a ministry called N4, the letter N, the number 4, and it embraces the fact that our campus is in Garden City. Okay, we don't all live in Garden City. Many of us commute from all around the valley, but God has placed us in terms of where our locker room is. He's placed that locker room in Garden City. And when we created the banner of N4, of being in Garden City for Garden City, it's a time when I was praying and saying, God, what are we to build on what the first generation did? The first generation has given us this amazing foundation. What do you want to build on it? And what God spoke to me, and it's a story I tell in Vineyard 101. If you don't know this story, it's because you haven't been to Vineyard 101 yet, so you need to sign up. We're starting one in a few weeks. But God told me very clearly that we are to embrace the fact that he's placed us in Garden City. And our posture towards the city is to be to serve the city. That we're to love the city. We're to seek God's transformation of the city. And so for years now, the way that we've been making the visible God visible, one big aspect of that is to say, what does it look like for us to not limit our impact to Garden City? We're called to the whole city, the whole valley, the whole nation, and the whole world, in fact. That's why we're sending people to Costa Rica and Puerto Rico. But we must always consider what that looks like in Garden City. And so under that banner, we made partnerships with Whittier, like we did the big Whittier Christmas project this year. That's a school, with Mayor Evans of Garden City, with the Garden City Police Department, the Boys and Girls Club. We got an ice cream truck that we send to the city for free. We established movie nights, church on the field, all these things that are part of being in Garden City for Garden City. And that's become ingrained in us. So that now that's part of our DNA. We're never going to stop being in Garden City for Garden City. That's part of our calling. But in 2018, so when I stood up here last year and gave our mission for the year, there was a fresh aspect to it. It wasn't about replacing N4. We're still going to be in Garden City for Garden City. But God was giving us a new mission. He was saying, okay, you've accomplished that one to the degree that I want you to focus on something else now. I want you to focus on, here's the next mission. And so last year I came and said, this is our mission. It's to fully and lovingly engage a post-Christian culture. And this was a vision that we actually, or a mission that we used, in order to explain this, we used the metaphor of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery, heading west with the idea that they were going into uncharted territory. They were going off the map of what they knew. But what they expected is that they were going to summit the Continental Divide, and then at the Continental Divide, they would find a water source that would carry them all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. And so everything in front of them would look like everything behind them, just in reverse. But what happened is they got to this Continental Divide, and instead of seeing a long, gentle slope and a water source that would carry them all the way to the Pacific Ocean, they saw jagged peaks, snow-covered, treacherous peaks as far as the eye could see. And they realized, wow, the past didn't prepare us for the future. And if we're going to go where we're supposed to go, if this Corps of Discovery is supposed to accomplish its mission, we're going to have to let go of our expectations that are formed by what we've experienced in the past and embrace learning new ways to do things. In fact, their language was they would have to literally leave the canoes behind that they'd carried. They'd brought canoes with them, thinking once we get to the Continental Divide, we can just hop in the canoes and coast. The hard work's been done. And what they realized is these canoes aren't really helpful for us in the place where we're going. And if we're going to accomplish the mission, we have to leave them behind, experiment, adapt, evaluate our experiment, keep learning, and if we ever need canoes again, we'll build new ones that are appropriate for the time and place in which we live. As we came to the vision statement last year, we said, look, what God's calling us to recognize is that the world around us has changed. We've changed. And if we're going to be effective in the mission that God has given us, we're going to have to recognize that we live in a different world. The world that's in front of us looks very different than the world behind us. And even within church world, there's this shifting landscape in culture and church. And Europe's ahead of us. Europe is already a post-Christian continent. And what's happened here in America is we now live in a post-Christian nation. Christendom has passed as an age that defines us. And so what that means is that we're going to have to figure out new ways to do things. And we can't have the same expectations about the future. So this was a big, involved concept. And in some ways, it was hard to get our minds and hearts around. But we spent time doing this. We talked about some other aspects of fully and lovingly engaging a post-Christian culture. We said part of us being relevant for the moment in which we live is we need to be more fully engaging. That means collaborative leadership. It means greater participation in our Sunday time. It means a shift from spectator experience on Sunday to participatory. Like when we got rid of the rows of chairs where we're all facing one direction and it's kind of a spectator experience, and we brought in tables, that was a response to creating a lovingly and fully engaging culture. That we have to have more participation because faith is not a spectator sport, right? So how do we do this? So we talked about what does it mean to be loving, that our posture towards a culture in a time where everything's shifting and it can start to feel uneasy and it can create a sense of angst, it can create a sense of fear, it can create a resistance. Like, what is the posture of our heart supposed to be towards the culture and a culture that has become post-Christian? What is our posture supposed to be? And it's not supposed to be this, it's supposed to be this. Okay? We're to fully, lovingly engage a post-Christian culture. So that's been the year of 2018, and as we approached the vision retreat for this last fall, I was thinking about, okay, so where are we now? Did we accomplish that mission? And I realized, you know what? In my evaluation, we've barely begun. We've made some concrete steps, but we're kind of like the people of Israel when they entered into the promised land. And there was a moment in which they were clearly in the promised land. They were no longer in the wilderness. They were now in the promised land, but they hadn't even begun the campaign. For them, the moment was this, that they, for 40 years, the first generation had wandered in the wilderness, and then the second generation was preparing to go into the promised land. They came up to the edge of the River Jordan, and the River Jordan formed a boundary that once they crossed that boundary, they were no longer in the wilderness that was familiar to them, and they were now in the uncharted territory, the off-the-map place of the promised land. And so there's the whole story about them crossing the Jordan River. But then they get across, and now they're in the promised land, and the question then became, okay, what do we do now? We're in the promised land, but we have not inherited it yet. So what do we do? And that was my perception, is that's where we are. We've crossed the Jordan, but we haven't even begun the first campaign. We're just barely in. So my expectation was not a brand new mission statement, but clarity. That was confirmed to me during a hike that we went on. Pastor Michael had a strong sense that we were supposed to go on a hike to begin with. This hasn't been a part of our vision retreats in the past. We haven't gone hiking together, but we were actually supposed to start with a hike. And so we were up in Cascade. We hiked into a lake called Blue Lake. Part of our hike was together, and I'll be sharing more about this in the coming weeks, about some of the things that God spoke to us. But then when we got to Blue Lake, we actually separated and each had some time alone with God and just had a chance to take our journals and just make space and say, God, would you speak to us? And so I ended up climbing up on top of this rocky knoll and just sitting there with this beautiful scenery all around me. I had my journal, and I just began listening, writing things that God was kind of awakening in me and highlighting to me. And God gave me in that moment 2 specific questions that we were supposed to ask that would organize our retreat. Remember, this is the beginning before we started. And the 2 questions were this. It was, what is our Jericho, and what is your strategy? If you think about that language of Israel going over the Jordan and they're in the promised land, but now they're wondering, what do we do next? The very first campaign that God gave them was Jericho. And so that was the question we were supposed to ask God. Okay, we're in the uncharted territory. We're trying to go off the map. What's our Jericho? And then having identified that, what's your strategy? Because if you think about when God told them that Jericho was going to be their first campaign, he gave them a strategy that was, from a military perspective, somewhat unorthodox. Right? You know the story? It was this. It was, okay, here's a walled city with technology that you've never experienced. You are to walk around the city once a day for 7 days, and on the 7th day, walk around 7 times, and then blow some Hebrew kazoos really loudly. And see what happens. I have to think that the military strategists in their community were not satisfied with that as a strategy. But here's the thing, when God speaks, it's not always in ways that people understand immediately. And what they had to do is they had to trust him, and they had to say, okay, we will walk forward in that, and we'll trust you to lead us in it. Oftentimes when we say yes to God, we don't really understand the plan, we just understand the person. We know who we're saying yes to, not what we're saying yes to. So they said yes to the person, and they started following it. So this was to be our question, and so these questions really reflected the questions that Joshua was asking at the time, and so here's the key verse of our retreat. It's Joshua 5:13. This is right after they've crossed over the Jordan. They're on the other side. Jericho at this point is ahead of them, and Joshua represents the leadership. The leadership trying to discern what is next. This is what happens. Joshua was by Jericho. He lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Okay. Joshua, he's a commander. He's a military strategist. He actually led some of the military campaigns under Moses. And so he's in battle mode. He's thinking, here's a warrior. Here's somebody coming with a sword. I need to know, are they on my side or their side? And so he just asks. He says, whose side are you on, my side or their side? You know what the answer is? No. He said, no. I am commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. That was a goosebump moment for Joshua. You got to know that. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and he worshiped. He said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Theologians would tell us that there are times in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scripture, where we see Jesus appear prior to his incarnation in the book of Matthew and Luke, prior to the virgin birth, that Jesus did not come into existence at the time of the virgin birth. Jesus is eternal. He's part of the Trinitarian Godhead. And in fact, John tells us that Jesus was the agent through which all of creation was spoken into existence. He pre-exists everything. He's eternal. And there's moments early on in creation, before the incarnation, where he shows up. And one of the ways we distinguish between those and when it's just a messenger, when it's just like an angel, is that angels, when angels show up to people, people try to worship them, and the angels always say, "No, you can't worship me. I'm simply a messenger." But when it's a Christophany, when it's a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus, it's Jesus taking on flesh at the moment, then he allows worship. This guy comes, Joshua says, "Are you for us or against us?" He says, "No. I have my side. Are you on it? I'm the one in charge of the mission." And when he says that, Joshua has the only response he can have at the moment, which is to fall on his face and worship. Right? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Joshua asked a question, let me go back. Joshua said, "What does my Lord?" So first he worships, and then he says, "Okay, what's the plan?" As soon as he understood who was in charge, and it was not about his side, but about his side, he says, "I want to be on your side. What do you want? What's the plan?" Here's the response. The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. That's Hebrew language for worship. He says, the plan will come. I'll give you instructions on how to get there right now. This is a sacred moment. This is holy ground. Just keep worshiping. And what we walked out of that with was knowing that this passage became the key verse for our retreat because it just reflects where we were. We're just on the other side of the Jordan and we're asking, what's our Jericho? What's your plan? And God says, that'll come, and I want you to worship. And so we spent the next 3 days, we spent intentional time in times of corporate worship together. Just not trying to come up with strategy, just saying, God, we worship you. We place ourselves before you. And over the next few weeks, I'll have time to share other things that happened during those 3 days. But what I want to jump forward to now is the final morning of our retreat. And we were in a time of worship. And at the end of that, we were just harvesting what God had been doing in each one of us. It was an extended time of worship. And it was beautiful. And at the end of it, we said, okay, what was God doing? And Janet was one of the first ones to share, Pastor Janet. And she shared a vision that God had given her during that time of worship. And so I asked Janet if she would come and share that today. Janet, are you here? There you are. Would you guys welcome Pastor Janet?
Thank you. Yeah, so as Pastor Trevor said, we were in a circle worshiping and just waiting and listening for God. And I wrote the experience down in my journal, so I'll be reading from that. But as we were there, so For me, the setting just changed, and we were all seated around the warmth of a campfire, surrounded by the darkness of the forest at night. Jesus was squatting down in the midst of our circle, right there with us, squatting down on his haunches, extending his hands toward the fire, and his face showed the joy of being with us. He was laughing and listening to the stories that we were sharing around the fire. Beyond the light of the fire were very large, shadowy figures, really large, shadowy figures. And I knew them to be angelic hosts who were providing protection by surrounding our circle. But they were also leaning in to hear the stories. They were attentive and they were keen to be a part of what was happening. As I looked around the circle to see each of us who were part of the retreat, the person that I would look at would appear as Jesus. In other words, when I looked at where Sharon Prosh was sitting, I only saw Jesus, even though I knew I was looking where Sharon was sitting. And then as I looked around to see where Jesse was sitting, there was Jesus. Each person around the circle appeared as Jesus when I looked at him or her. I understood this to mean that each of us represents Jesus. He is in us, and he is right where we are at all times. Each of us is empowered by the Holy Spirit to look like Jesus. And in fact, that is how we're seen by him. He's excited to be with us on the journey. It's great to warm ourselves by the fire and the camaraderie and to rest for a bit. But we need to, and we will, move on from here. There's more on the trail ahead for this core of discovery. The overarching feeling of this was warmth and Jesus' joy being in the midst of our company and of our adventure. Thanks.
When Janet shared that, something happened in the circle that we were gathered in. In fact, what happened is it became a campfire moment. And other ones of us began to share what that meant to us. And here's what we're discovering as we commit increasingly to a collaborative style of leadership, a collaborative approach to leadership, is God doesn't give any one of us the whole message. He gives it in pieces, and we have to have the humility to share those things with one another and to listen to one another and let the whole be fleshed out through all of us. And so we began to share, and literally there was like this visceral response where we just got excited about what had just happened, about this vision, because God ignited something in us. Our spirits were awakened to something beyond just a human idea. And so we began to respond to that. So I want to give you a moment to do the same thing this morning. And so on your tables, there's a worksheet that has a place for up to 20 characteristics, or you can do more if you want, but up to 20 characteristics of Campfire. And what I want you to do is together, there's only one per table because this is collaborative. And so if you're at a table by yourself, you got to join somebody else. This is not a solo activity. But think about the experiences, the characteristics of what happens around the campfire, and just begin listing as many as you can. Okay? On your mark, get set, go. All right, one more minute. Yeah, 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Ten seconds. Five seconds. All right, now we're done. All right, here's what I need you to do. I need you to look at your workshop list and see how many you have. Does anybody have all 20 lines filled out? A lot of you. Okay, how many have 25? How many have at least 25? Some 25s? Does anybody have 26? How many do you have? 27? How many do you guys have? 30? Does anybody have more than 30? More than 30? Well done. I need one representative from the 30 table. Come on, and you gotta bring your worksheet because I'm gonna make sure you're not messing with me. Good job, table 61. You guys are happy campers. Oh wait, stay here. Here's what I have for you. Nicely done. This is a gift. This is our staff Christmas gift that we gave to our staff as a Christmas present this year, as a reminder of what we were saying yes to. You can't open it yet. I'll tell you when you can open it. Okay? All right. So, I'm going to go back to our retreat. We did what you guys just did. We just sat there after our time of worship and we just began harvesting. What does this image of the campfire mean to us? And Amber shared, Pastor Amber had just in her private reading that morning, having nothing to do with the retreat, just doing some of the work that she was been, part of the schooling that she'd been part of, where she had a reading assignment. And she said, I read this about campfires this morning. She said the task, and we're just going to insert Vineyard Boise here in place of the church. The task of Vineyard Boise is to be positioned like a campfire in the wilderness, welcoming sojourners from all corners of life to stop, relax, and yarn for a while. A place where tired bodies and spirits are warmed by the fire and refreshed. A friendly atmosphere where stories of the road are shared amongst travelers. The job of Vineyard Boise is to keep the fire burning because one never knows when a traveler will come to sit. It doesn't matter where on the journey the traveler has been exploring or how long they've been walking. If they come in peace to sit on a log by the campfire, they are welcome. Isn't that cool? That's from a book called Spiritual Direction. And that was by author Simon Brown. So as we're fleshing this out, we didn't and we don't yet understand everything that this means. We know that it begins to give us an answer to our question, what is our Jericho and what is your strategy? But we began to think, so here's some of the things that as we created a list, here's some of the things that we noticed as we paused to think about what happens at a campfire. Campfires are beacons of hope, of warmth, of companionship in the darkness. Campfires, or at a campfire, the light is reflected and illuminates every face. You're facing a fire, and it's that reflection that people actually see. It's level ground at a campfire. Everyone is centered on the fire. Campfires are not for the indoors. They're for explorers, for adventurers, for uncharted territory, for going off the map. No one gathers around a fire pit unless there's actually a fire there. You ever see people sitting around an empty fire? Lost people get found by a fire. Travelers, sojourners, exiles, they keep moving and then they restart the fire wherever they are, wherever they pause, because fires are portable. Campfires are for the wilderness. They're a beacon of warmth, of refreshment, of friendship. It's a place of storytelling shared with fellow travelers. The campfire is to be kept alive because you never know when a weary traveler will arrive. We can only share fire if we are maintaining our own fire. That's important. Campfires are the equivalent of home in uncharted territory. They're the equivalent of home when in uncharted territory. There are no rows at campfires, only circles. Campfires are a place of invitation for those who are cold. Campfires have a fragrance that lingers. You know when somebody's been around a campfire. And lastly, at least on this list, campfires are a good place to sacrifice our canoes. We had actually a wooden canoe with us. We literally burnt it on a campfire. Here's what God does. God gives us these concrete images that help us to think about our life together, that give us a shared language. The shared language we're going to embrace this year is the campfire. And sometimes, here's what that means. Sometimes that means that we're intentionally about creating a campfire experience. So we let that color the way we organized our Christmas service this year. We said, let's try and organize our Christmas around campfires. And so rather than sitting in Heritage Hall singing songs all facing the fireplace or facing the stained glass window, we gathered in a round and we sang in the round like you do at a campfire. All on level ground, no stage, right? We came in here and we had campfire experiences. We literally had fires on every table because we wanted to have a campfire experience right here in the room. Then we went outside and we had fire pits. And nobody got burned. It was awesome. So sometimes we're intentional. So part of this saying yes to this year is intentionally creating those experiences, and they're not going to look all the same. There's many types of campfire. My wife did a search and just started looking on the interwebs, source of all knowledge. She found there's a lot of different types of campfire. There's not just one. And we need lots of types of campfire. There's also those moments where we didn't intentionally create a campfire experience, but we suddenly realize we're having one. And just since September, we've had moments where we just paused and said, oh, wow, this is a campfire experience. This is holy ground. God's presence is here. We're gathered around the presence of God, and he's doing something that's warming our hearts. Let's pause and pay attention. Let's say yes to it. 2019 is a year of creating campfires and recognizing when God's doing them so that we can say yes, so that we can participate. We don't know everything that's going to involve, but as a staff, we're committing to that. So one of the things so if I was to go back to our two questions, what are the questions we're supposed to ask of God? What's our Jericho? Our Jericho this year is a refocus from macro discipleship to micro discipleship. Okay? Last year we were moving into uncharted territory for the first time. The first kind of strategic thing was to say, how do we do things differently on our Sundays? And we began to look at macro discipleship. Campfires are not necessarily what happens in here. They're more of a micro discipleship. They're what happens when we're in circles that are more intimate. And how does that transform? How do we find discipleship and transformation at the campfire? What is your strategy? Asking God, what is your strategy? Well, his strategy that he's given us so far is to build campfires. Here's how we're defining this. All this is a working definition for now. Campfires are intentional and intimate gatherings of people around the presence of God for the purpose of transformation, relationship, belonging, restoration, and the glory of the invisible God made visible. So as a leadership team, one of the things we're committed to is to being fire starters, to being fire builders, fire tenders. And so the staff Christmas gift I gave the staff this year was actually Zippo lighters. Here's a picture. You can go ahead and open yours now. You can open yours now. There's a Zippo lighter in there. And here's what's on them. It's Vineyard Boise 2019, the year of the campfire. The verse on there is very important, though, because at the very core of the campfire is the fire itself. And before we get into the characteristics of who's there and what's happening, it's what's at the middle. And it's all about the presence of God. Here's what Exodus 40:38 says. At night, fire glowed inside the clouds so the whole family of Israel could see it. This continued throughout all their journeys. And it's the story, so often in Scripture, fire is a visible reminder of God's presence. The invisible God is present with his people. And so as we gather, there's an intentional leaning into the fact that we gather around the presence of God. We are to be attentive to that. We are to be surrendered to it. We are to cultivate our awareness of the presence of God. And at the very core of the campfire experience, before we start fleshing out any more of it over the next few weeks, It's this: we are a people gathered around the presence of God. And so I'd like you to join me as the way that we're going to just consecrate the year of 2019 to the year of the campfire is we're just going to respond in a song of worship and say, God, at the very core of what we want, we are a people of your presence. So the worship team is going to come and they're going to lead us in this last song. And why don't you go ahead and stand with me? And Jesse's going to lead us in this last song, and then he's just going to close us with a prayer. And as you think about this, here's what I'd ask. Would you give yourself to this as well? As a leadership team, this is what we've done. We've said, yes, we don't completely understand the plan, but we do know the person we're saying yes to. And we want to know you more and more. And so we're inviting you to be at our core, to be in our midst. May we surrender to you. So as you sing the song, would you invite God's presence into our life together and into your life specifically?